public authorities are afraid of public space. Every single public project that we try to do has been a fight, because you hear things like criminalization of, oh my God, what will happen if you open a public space, and people will kill each other. It took years for NGOs like Nahnu to convince the municipal authority to open the city's main public park, and they had to train their own guys to do it. That's our main crisis.
Welcome to the afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on the series, we have Professor Muna Fawaz, who is a professor at the American University of Beirut. Muna, welcome to the series.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So both you and I live in Beirut. Actually, we live probably like maybe a kilometer away from each other. And you spend a lot of time thinking about urban studies and cities and inhabitants and how people live in these cities. I want to ask you a really basic question. Do you like Beirut?
Oh, I love Beirut. I love Beirut. I think despite all the difficulties that the city is going through, despite a lot of truly awful hardship that we see every day, the city still has a lot of magic.
It's funny. When you walk around, did you grow up in Beirut?
Yeah, I did during the Civil War.
Yeah, I wonder, does the city today resemble the city that you grew up in as well? Do you feel this sort of the DNA, the common DNA?
I think there's a lot of things that have changed enormously in the last 13 years in Beirut. That's definitely true. But there remains a lot of, I don't think I just like what it was, actually. I think the city has evolved and it grows on you, and you build social networks and you learn to relate to people and to understand their stories. And so you begin to feel like you're part of something that's quite real, and you learn to appreciate things that bring you together with other people, the corniche, a way people look at each other when you're walking on the street. I don't know. So I think that's mostly what remains in many ways constant. But then again, the city has definitely changed a lot, yeah.
Yeah, I love Beirut. I live here. I always say I live here on purpose. And I have a really strong connection to the city. You run a program or a project called the Alternative History of Beirut. So it begs a question. What do you think is the dominant history of Beirut? And why do you think that needs a counterpart?
Okay, yeah, that's. I think that's a great place to start. I didn't start thinking about an alternative city history of Beirut. I was trained as a city planner, and I truly studied city planning because I wanted to make a difference. I studied first architecture here at AB, and then I went to the United States and studied city planning. And I truly thought that I would be able to contribute to making Beirut a different city. And in studying city planning, I began to realize that many of the things that we grew up thinking are the outcomes of the Civil War, and I was taught are the outcome of the Civil War, actually went way deeper and older than the Civil War itself. So if you think about social injustices, how they reflected spatially in informal settlements, but also the privatization of public spaces, including the beach. So a lot of things that we thought of as temporary outcomes of the Civil War that would be reversed appeared to actually be quite common in capitalist economies around the world, and to be addressed very differently than the way we address them here, because they're not thought of as temporary oddities that are the outcome of the war, but actually entrenched results of social injustices, a specific kind of economy that doesn't make place for the urban majorities. And so I began to work on informal settlements, what we call informal settlements. And these are neighborhoods that in Lebanon were largely dismissed as temporary outcomes of the Civil War, but that when I dug further, appeared to be neighborhoods that were produced as of the 1940s in Beirut's ever-expanding peripheries by mostly rural migrants, but also refugees and migrant workers coming from Syria, way before we even had Lebanon and Syria, flocking to Beirut as a place where they can work and make a living when life became impossible in their villages due to many forces. And so I first studied several neighborhoods thinking that I wanted to make a difference and influence public policy, and gradually realized that these neighborhoods actually told a very different history than the history I was at the same time teaching my students and reading, the history, especially of the 1950s and 1960s, that those of us who grew during the Civil War were told are the heyday of Beirut. If you read the otherwise great book of Samir Asir, for example, that brings together really all the research of Beirut, the 1950s and the 1960s are when women in Beirut started wearing mini skirts and walk around al-Hamra and sit openly in cafes and wear bikinis in the Peninsula. No one tells you that the 1950s and the 1960s are also when people were crammed in Beirut suburbs, desperately trying to make a living, desperately trying to be city makers also on their own, and actually in many ways succeeding. So what began really as a very applied urban planning project became eventually an alternative history of Beirut, in which I document my working on 3 neighborhoods of Beirut's suburbs, the way in which people arrived, what kind of alliances they forged, how they actually had to build relations with powerful people in the city and exchange favors so that they can stabilize their neighborhoods and not be evicted, but how much also agency there was among them in doing self-help sewer systems, organizing rules when there are no planning rules so that there's streets and water and a good life in these areas. And so, that's the project. And I find that I don't have enough time these days to really work on these more like long-term reflective projects, but I think they're incredibly important because they have enormous relevance still to date on why is Beirut the way it is.
Yeah. Can I ask you what those 3 neighborhoods are?
Yeah, of course. So in the first neighborhood I worked on a lot is Hayy el-Sellom. It's when you land in the Beirut International Airport, you actually land right by the neighborhood. You see it to your left at the very end behind the industrial hangars. It's Beirut's largest informal settlement. It started developing since the 1950s. It has a unique history. That's where I did my dissertation. And then I started expanding to understand other neighborhoods, and I worked on Nabaa, which is another neighborhood south of Burj Hammoud, which is on the immediate edge of Beirut, right behind the Beirut River. And it grew very much in relation to the Armenian refugees who arrived to Beirut in the 1920s. And finally, Zaitriyeh, which is the least known of them, and it's in Panar, in the area of Panar, so people don't think there's a lot of informalities there. But that's also like a neighborhood that started because 2 very well-off individuals formed a land development agency that still operates till today and is one of Beirut's well-established land development agencies. And they wanted to do in Beirut suburban housing, just like the US suburban housing. So you see the advertisements of that period in Revue du Liban and Commerce du Levant. And you see like a couple sitting in front of a television and moving back to their suburban house and stuff like that. And it's an idea that was circulating like in Egypt and Lebanon during that period.
Living the American dream in method.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then it doesn't work because the Beirutis are too attached to their Beirut, and it's kind of great to be able to walk to work actually and shop. So people didn't really move there. And so they eventually accept to sell it through a real estate mediator to migrants coming from the Beqa who are fleeing drought and are unable anymore to plant the land. And so the Zaitriyeh tribes eventually buys these lots and subdivides them and begins to build these small incremental homes that are first fully legal. They just don't correspond to the imaginary of a modern city. But what you find in Nabaa and Zaitriyeh and Hayy el-Sellom is that by the mid-60s, regulators are appalled that the city would look like this. So they start passing regulations that make people illegal. And the more people build, the more they pass regulations and design highways to erase the neighborhoods. And that becomes the way in which poverty is dealt with, by criminalizing it, instead of like doing what other countries have done, which is to try to integrate them in the city and extend infrastructures and realize that cities are made by this diversity.
I want to ask you this idea of just another basic question. You've mentioned the phrase informal settlement. What is like a formal settlement and what is an informal settlement in the context? I mean, settlement, I can't unhear like occupiers when I hear settlement.
Yeah.
It's like hard for me to detach that word from the idea of colonizing.
Okay,
so
yes.
What is a formal settlement versus an informal settlement?
So
and
cities are
is one better than
settlements.
the other?
Settlements are just places where people stay, right? Where they live. So if you go back to like the first official urban literature on the city, we call cities like permanent, heterogeneous, dense, large-size human settlements. We call Ur the first city in the world as the first human settlement. It's where you're settled for a long time. So the sad association with what Israeli occupation is now doing in Palestine makes the term problematic and connects it more to a history of also forced settlement in the United States historically. Yeah. But that's not at all what I mean. So among city planners, when we call the neighborhood an informal settlement, we actually are trying to reject the proposition that these neighborhoods can be called illegal because we don't want to define them as opposed to the law. Instead, by calling them informal, I'm referring to a whole set of rules and norms that are basically decided by residents collectively and that organize the way in which they live. So I'm recognizing that rather than a negative, they actually are abiding by sets of rules that this collectivity has managed to develop and uphold so it can live together well. So that's really only where settlement comes from. Yeah, I thought you would be reacting more to informal because that term also has a lot of question marks to it. Yeah.
No, I mean, this idea, because in a city like Beirut, there is maybe an illusion of organic evolution and organic life. Maybe it's not an illusion at all, but every now and then I think to myself, like, was this all planned out and it just 100 years later, and so I don't see the seams anymore, but people actually very intentionally chose and planned these things out. And this is not an organic sort of sprouting of human society and life. And so the idea that you would use a term like informal settlement, not you, but anyone would use a term like informal settlement, for me, that just means organic settlement.
Well, it's not spontaneous. It's never developed not in relation to something else, right? And I mean, Beirut has had its own set of rules. We've adopted our first building law in the 1940s. We adopted our first master plan. We still have the same one since 1954. That's quite incredible. I wouldn't say the city is not growing, is growing completely outside of planning. I would say planning is a massive culprit in Lebanon for what Beirut has become. Because, I mean, if you think about what planning really is, planning as a profession is about how will we live together? What rules will guide us as a collectivity in how we build? And what we've done, particularly in the last 30 years, is that we've decided that thing we have that's Beirut, we're going to turn it into an asset that we can invest in and sell the best possible way. And our planning regulations have really facilitated and pushed an imaginary of a city where you just demolish and rebuild higher because you can make higher profits. And that profit, if it comes at the expense of whoever is living in the city or is able to live in the city, it doesn't really matter. So planning is very much pushing for this. If you just take a very simple example of Hamra, since both of us are there. Until 1971, Hamra, like the rest of Beirut, had a restriction in height. So you couldn't build more than 6 floors. And so the city developed at this very time when modern architecture was inspiring everyone, and you still see a lot of the remnants of that period. By 2004, in order to encourage even more investments in the built environment, we passed another building law. And that building law created even more facilities for developers. And it basically made it that a building that had a height restriction of 6 floors could now go for 12 or even 14. Except those 6-floor buildings had people who were still under the old rent control, who lived there, who shopped in the local neighborhood store, who had a life with the neighborhood, whose ground floor had a little store that opened on a sidewalk. The high-rises that were built in Hamra between 2004 and 2012, 13, that period of big boom, first completely ravaged the fabric, the modern fabric of the city. Second, replaced buildings that were inhabited with high-rise towers that are mostly empty, where a lot of apartments are actually held as in the future, I'll come and live here, or I'll sell it, I'll make a lot of profit. So I basically call them safety deposit boxes, not homes, right? And the ground floor is like a fence. It's not a door, it's not a store, it doesn't speak to the street. And I really don't want to criminalize the people who live in these buildings, but when I'm walking in Hamra to go get my groceries, I often notice how many of them are coming in and out of remote control SUVs, and they don't know anyone in the neighborhood. So your relationship to the whole area is completely transformed. And that kind of physical production, which happened in the last decade, is fully the outcome of planning. It's not the lack of planning. It's just planning that thinks of the collectivity as somewhere where you can extract profit, as opposed to an us that thinks together about how we want to live together.
Yeah. So you said something interesting, this idea of this master plan that we're still living with. What is the brief history of this master plan?
It's quite crazy, actually, because in the 1950s, we began to develop what we call land use plans. And these land use plans basically say what you can build and where. During that time, people were very concerned about making cities better adapted to the car, something which we don't do anymore, but we still do it in Lebanon. But city planners teach you is a terrible idea. So we should be investing instead in urban walkability and what makes sidewalks safer and greener so that people can spend some time together. But during that period, that was essentially how do you guide building activity and how do you facilitate vehicular mobility. And so we started importing French planners who would sort of advise local planners, and there was a conversation, and effectively in 1954 they adopted a first land use plan of the city. It's a very classic plan. It still thinks the city like in what we call concentric circles. So the center is very dense, and then the peripheries become less and less and less dense. That basically explains to you also why the areas around the city's historic core, like Ashrafiyeh, Mono, and Spears, are also prone to being demolished. It's because the master plan imagined that they would have very high densities, but they actually were the neighborhoods that had the heritage buildings. So they were 2- and 3-story floors. And so again, when we allowed people to demolish old buildings and build high rises, the master plan continues to guide that. And that master plan hasn't been changed because there's so much vested interest. Any new zoning would want to reduce the exploitation factors, how much you can build. And of course, people who own land have been trained for the last 50 years that land is an asset because you can sell it, not because you live in it. And so the master plan, the planning became the way in which we actually are destroying and continue to destroy Beirut.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as you are calling me right now from a university, you're a professor at AUB in the Department of Urban Studies and Urban Planning. Are we creating a new generation of planners who may have any ability to reimagine the future of Beirut?
Yes. I mean, we sure hope so. And our students are definitely carrying a very different conversation in Beirut. I'm actually really proud of our architecture students, of our urban planning students, because when they come out of AUB, they have an understanding of the collective, of the importance of public space, not because they look good and, you can sell the square meter better, but many of them have an aspiration of building a different city. Where it blocks really is Like when I studied, I always give this example to my students. When I did first my master's in city planning, more than 2/3 of my classmates in the United States went out to work either directly or indirectly for the public sector. So they worked either in city authorities or in planning agencies or the environmental planning agency, etc., or they work in community development corporations that are funded by the state to make sure neighborhoods have affordable housing and other direly needed necessities. I've been teaching here now for more than 20 years. I have only taught one student from the public sector. And after she graduated, she actually went and started working for the public sector in Qatar. She didn't stay here. And I've begged wealthy Lebanese politicians to fund one student permanently that would be a public sector student that would come in and out and actually try to implement from public authorities, from any public agency, from any municipality, for just 3 years, some of the stuff we teach, and haven't been successful yet. And I think that's what's critical, that we can bring in these ideas in public agencies. Because look, planning ultimately relies on the fact that there is a custodian for the public good. And the imaginary is that custodian is the state. So when you say this is a public space, public has someone who cares for it. There's a collectivity. And in theory, that collectivity is democratic and is represented by public authority that would clean that space, that will, that will design it, maintain it, green it, ensure that people who behave inside it relate to each other. Our public authorities are afraid of public space. So if you talk to them, every single public project that we tried to do has been a fight, because you hear things like criminalization of, oh my God, what will happen if you open a public space and people will kill each other. It took years for NGOs like Nahnu to convince the municipal authority to open the city's main public park, and they had to train their own guys to do it. So that's our main crisis. It's that the city does not have a champion. The collective in the city is missing that custodian that we can work with to plan.
Do you think it's based out of valid fears, ignorance, cynicism? Where does it come from?
Look, I can recount very briefly our most recent experience in Maram Hayy. We're working from the Beirut Urban Lab at AUB. I tried to start a project of implementing a vision for Beirut that was put forward by my late friend Habib Debith, which is called sort of the Plan Vert de Beirut. And that project, which is pegged with a soft mobility plan, basically proposes to widen sidewalks in Beirut by reducing parking space and pushing cars a little bit further from the neighborhoods. And it has a vision for how you move the cars and what you do with them. But essentially, even without reducing parking spots, you want to design streets in a way that you prioritize people's mobility over cars' mobility instead of the other way around. And it's really doable in Beirut. All sorts of surveys have been done, and they basically show that city dwellers are afraid to walk on the sidewalk, and they have tons of accidents about why it's dangerous to walk. You fall, you break a leg, someone opens a store, something falls on you from a construction site. There are all sorts of little things that actually can be addressed. You don't need a resolution for the settler colonial project in Palestine to solve the sidewalks in Beirut. It just needs enough political will. So we designed a small pilot project, and we brought the funding, and we started implementing. We did a lot of community participation, talked to residents, everyone wants it. We start implementing the project. 2 weeks in, we have a municipal permit. Of course, we're working very closely with the city governor and the mayor. 2 weeks into the implementation, a local strongman comes in and says, you need to take my permission. And within just 2 weeks, things escalate to the point that the archbishops of Beirut are meeting to take a position against the project. And some of the store owners in the neighborhood are giving TV interviews in which they're saying, if we open a public space, people will kill each other. So it becomes an issue of who controls the street and how. And I think that genuinely the political class is quite aware of the positive potential of allowing people to meet and talk together. And I'm not being romantic. It is well possible that people will also hit each other in public space. But as long as we're creating that sense of fear of the other, we are maintaining a geography of the civil war. During that period, I heard stuff like, why are you coming from Hamra to work in Mar Mikhael? Go back to your area. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that 30 years after the end of the Civil War, we're still holding this kind of language. But that's the kind of control over the street that the political class wants to exert. So I think that's why it's so hard to do public space. It's because it's a project that really threatens the core of how our system of governance operates by dividing people and forcing their clientelistic alliance along sectarian lines.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, I mean, has this worked anywhere globally? I mean, has a city like Beirut that has those layers, a weak state, strong men, a media that's willing to inflame, a history of civil war, a colonial past that has, superimposed these types of ideas onto different terrains that may not work. Has anyone stuck the landing, made the turn? It's just cruising along.
Look, there's no La La Land, but there's definitely very inspiring experiences around the world. I've been reading quite a lot recently about cities in Latin America. And of course, it's not perfect, but there are excellent experiments in which municipal authorities have worked with communities and with researchers and universities in some cases to bring back municipal authorities in the city and improve safety. Cities like Medellin for many years relied on, people in neighborhoods relied on the organized crime groups in order to maintain the safety of their neighborhoods. And that, of course, on the one hand is disastrous because it means much higher levels of insecurity. But on the other, that's the only way they could cope with it. And so there's now great experiments about how there's been collaborations where municipal authorities have been able to rebuild the trust with local communities. And that in turn triggers all sorts of interventions that do improve the shared public spaces. We need to put this in place. And I'm a firm believer that city planning has that potential. So we were trained, my generation was trained to think that you start by building a custodian of the common good in the state. And then that custodian allows you to intervene as a city planner because you take your agency from your license from them about what is a collective good. And what I've come to believe in the last decade is that we should use planning to create a sense of a collective, because all residents in Beirut are dying from the polluted air generated by generators. We really are dying. We're also less intelligent. Our brains function less well because we inhale so much fumes. This is like documented. Colleagues in public health here at AUB have shown it fully. We all also feel very stressed out because we lack greenery, because we feel many of us have to commute for long hours because the apartments in the city have been turned into commodities. We've shown this in so many different projects, research projects at the Beirut Urban Lab. So basically, what we need to do is to bring people together around this idea of we want a city that's different. And by allowing that collective imaginary, maybe that will allow planning to become the place in which we can build that sense of a collective. So I think we can do it. I don't think it's impossible at all. But and I mean, we're lucky. We're just 1.3 million in Beirut. We're not like Cairo with over 20 million. So our problems are definitely solvable.
It's funny. I feel like when I think about it, it's not a problem of ideas. I mean, if I asked you right now, want to come up with the 10 most impactful ideas that would improve life in Beirut, life of all kinds in Beirut, right? You could probably on the back of an envelope write down these 10 ideas that you've had, that you probably could have written 10 years ago, come in. It just like, yeah, they're obvious. So it's not a question of like ideas. It's a question of buy it.
I agree.
Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It is. I mean, planning in its very core is a response to that question that I keep repeating. How will we live together? And so you want to convince people in Beirut that they have to live together, that they want to live together, and that it's in their interest to want that us. We don't have an us in Beirut. One day it's the refugees, one day it's the Christians or the Muslims, one day it's the migrant workers, one day... We need to build that connect. We need to be able to, maybe at the neighborhood level, maybe at building levels, recreate those collectivities that can imagine a we, because that we is essential to help you think through what they are willing to let you champion or what they are willing to champion themselves as a space that they want to live together with.
Can you give me a sense of a city, maybe even ideally a city somewhere close to us that is of proportionate size, that has an us?
I mean, I think the city we all keep going to and is not so close to us is possibly Barcelona. You can see in the neighborhoods of Barcelona, and Barcelona has also a lot of problems, I don't have any doubt, but if we look at the organization of the neighborhood and the decisions of reducing car ownership and creating those super blocks within which there are multiple local level neighborhood services, including services to support kids who drop out of school to learn space, what you call object making stuff and stuff to allow them to reintegrate employment. So you see a much more integrated understanding of how neighborhoods operate that then foster support for certain kind of interventions that would otherwise seem counterintuitive. Chief among them, the idea that you won't be parking your car under your house, sorry, and maybe guess what? You're going to drop your car and walk. So experiments like this are happening all the time. I think European cities are great examples for such interventions at the local scale. In Northern Europe, there's superb experiments with parks that run between immigrant and old-time resident neighborhoods and richer and poorer neighborhoods, and then a lot of work with the community to figure out what kind of activities you can program that can allow individuals who may fear each other, not only not want to live each other, cohabitate in the same space, and over time you find these spaces to really support interactions that would otherwise be impossible in the city. And these spaces of encounters are there in Beirut for sure. I mean, I know that skateboarders in Beirut meet in the Starco Park, and if you see kids coming from different areas of Beirut, my son would bring back to AUB kids that would never have imagined to walk into AUB, and they'd be trying stuff, and that's exactly the kind of promise that public spaces can make, that you can actually begin to create a sense of collective around certain practices, and from there on address bigger questions about how will we be together.
Yeah. But it's funny, I'm incredulous because I feel like that some of the examples that you gave are places without these strongmen, are places that have insanely strong states. And so, I mean, for me, it's like thinking about buying a Ferrari, and it's like, even if you could afford a Ferrari, you can't drive it on our streets. It's impossible, you know?
Why? I mean, look,
Yeah.
I mean, it's not impossible to imagine a neighborhood like Hamra. Hamra has dozens of empty buildings that are either abandoned or in the last decade been rehousing refugees in awful conditions, right? Disrepaired since the Civil War. We dug into who owns these buildings, and we figured out that many of these buildings are owned by investors who had developed them from the Arab Gulf or from Syria or Jordan, who had developed them before the Civil War, when Beirut was this sort of commercial hub, business hub that helped the intersection of the Arab Gulf and oil trade and gold trade with Europe. And these buildings have been abandoned really by their owners since then and neglected. And you can begin to think about why not recover these buildings as housing for the city? Like, what prevents you from actually doing this? And so we've been working with the Norwegian Refugee Council trying to invent a project in which we can recover some of these buildings. When I say we, it's in the research center that I helped co-found at the American University of Beirut, the Beirut Urban Lab. And I think that there's a lot of potential in putting forward that image for people in Hamra. How would you feel about these buildings being recovered as housing where students, where your relatives, where other people, can live in? And will that actually be seen as a threat by some of the authorities in Hamra? Probably. But can we create a demand for that because it's direly needed that sort of changes the conversation? I think we can. If we start from the premise that they've won, then we've lost. So we have to start with the premise that there are projects, maybe to begin with in the private realm. That's why I'm thinking of this project when we're talking, that we can where we can push the city in a different direction, where we can begin to recreate an economy that doesn't either rely on foreign aid or on clientelism, but actually on people living in the neighborhood and shopping in its local stores and using its cafes and recovering its life. You can't keep dealing with Beirut as a hijacked real estate waiting for the next boom to destroy it and build even high rises. You have to invent another economy. And I genuinely think there's a lot of us who are interested in that.
For sure. There's a huge amount of people who are interested in it. Those of us who are living in the shadows of these huge buildings, and yeah, definitely. And living in a constant construction site. Definitely. There's many of us, but I don't understand what the sort of the political mechanism or framework or instrument, what it would be to be able to reclaim and reimagine and these spaces. Like, I'll give you a great example. Here's a great example, and you'll know much more about it than I will. The space that used to be called Biel, okay? And for those listening who don't know anything about Beirut, this is like this huge amount of reclaimed land that where they like basically threw a bunch of concrete into the sea and created this like rectangular concrete plot that juts out from the edge of Beirut. That's my very basic description. Biel is like empty most of the time. Why it doesn't get turned into this huge public park is beyond me.
Biel, on the master plan that was approved for the private real estate company that was entrusted with the reconstruction of Beirut's historic core, is the city's biggest green park. And it was one of the conditions on which the company would be allowed to do the project. But they haven't planted a tree because no one held them accountable. It is quite amazing, actually, to understand why we are where we are, to go back to 1990 and to the central project of the reconstruction of the city's historic core. This Beirut's historic core, it's old city that predates, is given in 1990 to a private real estate company to rebuild it or to do with it what it wants. Now, a private real estate company is accountable to its shareholders. The historical core of the city is a collective place that should be owned by every single resident of Beirut. And I'm not using owned in the sense of a real estate company. I'm using owned in the sense of how we really think about it as something where I can project myself in the future, where I feel that me and many other people can look at this place and say, this is our past, this is from where we project our future, this is where I can meet other people with whom I share this city. That's what a city's historic core is. And imagine that its reconstruction is entrusted to a real estate company that will sell the land, because that's what real estate companies want to do, at the highest price, because it's accountable to its shareholders to give them the highest profit. And that original perception that the historic core of Beirut will be a real estate company has spilled over the rest of the city and the country and turned us in the last 30 years as basically a national real estate venture. We've changed our property laws, we've changed our urban regulations. Our central bank has done so much between 2005 and 2019 to encourage that practice, because it was using the money that was flowing from into real estate in order to maintain an artificial peg of the Lebanese pound. This was happening at the expense of people being able to live in Beirut. This was happening at the expense of people being able to work in Beirut. You couldn't afford to own a store. And even if you did, it was so much more beneficial for you to go put your money in the bank and get interest rate than actually open a store or a restaurant or anything else. And so we've hijacked our city, basically, and made it into a city for sale. That's why you have all those absurdities, right? I mean, how could it be? I remember giving this talk before the financial meltdown here at AB and saying, how can it be in 2019 that a city like Beirut that has no electricity, no water, no free healthcare, no free schooling, can sell its apartment more at a higher price than an apartment in a city like Lyon or Marseille in France, where you have all these services and actually more? And the answer is, it's because we were competing against, to be able to live here, and we continue to be, against investors who are basically looking to buy our city. And that perception has to change. We have to begin to understand that this city needs to have a redistributive, reproductive economy. And that's first and foremost a political project that needs to be championed. And once this works, then we can translate it into planning regulations and to projects. In the meantime, I think people like us are confined to basically try to do tests to demonstrate that the projects can work, small projects, recovering a building, designing a public space. But the core problem is that we've fundamentally hijacked the potential of the city from a place to live in into a place to sell, basically pieces of it. Not even to sell it collectively.
Yeah, I mean, what is the future for these types of projects?
Like Solidaire, I mean, if you look at Biel, I disagree with you that it's so abandoned. Go by on a Sunday and see what you want to see people really doing in a city. People from all walks of life are biking, walking, running, talking. So actually, it's quite a space of mixity. It's sadly dirty because there is no municipal authority that's actually really cleaning the space. It definitely should be greened. It definitely it needs to be more welcoming, but it already has the seats for places of mixity. So we saw also a moment of incredible hope during the Lebanese Revolution when places that had been destroyed and turned into parking lots, places to park your car during for years in Beirut's historic core, were reclaimed by people as soup kitchens, as places of temporary psychological coaching, or as places of public debate. And a lot of us, I gave my course that semester entirely in the public square in Beirut downtown. And next to my students here who were paying tuition at AUB, we had people come from the city and join us, and the students kept an incredibly positive memory of that shared experience of learning. And so I think we have seen examples, possible performances, if you want, of what it can be, that now allow us actually to cling to these images and project them back again to say this is where we should be going.
Yeah. You published an article maybe a year ago or so about the silos in the port of Beirut that was the site of the August 4th explosion, that still stand, and some see as an eyesore, some see as a painful memory, some see as a call to action, and some don't see anymore. I'm curious what you think we should do there.
I mean, I think we tried desperately. We didn't. The political class tried desperately. Really, I mean, when we say the political class, we're talking about a bunch of warlords and bankers who associated themselves to them after the Civil War and partnered with them. They basically designed together the project of a city that has pardoned the warlords. They pardoned themselves, right? And erased every single trace of every single crime that was done against city dwellers. And artists, activist groups have tried since the 1990s to stage installations, events, and revive that memory as a critical part of our shared history that needs to be kept alive if we are to transcend it and become a collectivity. And I think the silos are very much the same way. They are desperate to destroy that. They have invented so many different strategies and tactics to let them fall down slowly. And if you've been following the reconstruction of the port discussions that we've tried to make as public as we can, because they're important elements, you would see that there is an insistence by the current authorities to rebuild new silos exactly in the location of the old silos and to demolish the silos. And they want to do that because they want to erase the memory against the advice of structural engineers who tell them it would be really a terrible idea where there was an explosion to build new silos, against the recommendations of economists and people who are doing feasibility studies, because it would cost you 10 times more to redo the silos there than do them elsewhere. But they're insisting on doing it there because they want to continue the practice of erasing the city's memory. So although I was trained as an architect, I don't really care about the memory of architecture, but I think the memory of the war and the explosion has to remain as a memorial because we need to begin a different practice of collectively recognizing our shared history of violence as a way to transcend it. The whole reconstruction of the port, what it can be, why it was possible, actually, for a port that was like immediately inside the city to explode this way, and that ammonium nitrate was actually locked in that port for so many years. And we were exposed to that danger as city dwellers, and no one told us. Like, poses so many questions about how will you rebuild the port in a way that it's accountable to the city, and that actually it can recover its historical role to be open to the city, like it was. I mean, Beirut is a port city, but since 1990, Beirut is not a port city anymore, right? I mean, Beirut became a city where the port turns its back to the city, builds walls and securitized areas. And all the studies that were done since the port explosion that were funded by the World Bank on the request of the Lebanese government basically show that the port doesn't need to be that big. And just like cities like Genoa, Barcelona, Marseille, and others along the Mediterranean that have managed since the deindustrialization of ports to reclaim at least half the port area and use it as a way to create a redistributive economy that connects recreational, blue technologies back to the city and create employment for city dwellers in this area, that Beirut's port can and should do that. And I've seen those studies because I've volunteered my time working as a volunteer advisor with the city governor. So in order to advise him, I've seen these studies through him, and I've sat on tons of meetings in which we've actually officially asked for that. But the actual powers that be are refusing to do that, and they want to rebuild the exact same port, closed, and heaven knows what will be in it, and if we explode again, and if they erase the silos. So I think the reclaiming that the silos are protected is bigger than just like an architectural memory or a decision of aesthetics, whether it looks nice or not. It's actually a demand for more transparency, for accountability, for that has to be strong, and that actually does, I think, have a lot of support among city dwellers.
Yeah. It's like Burj al-Mur. Also another monument to lack of reconciliation and accountability. Before we go, I want to ask you a little bit about the Beirut Urban Lab and what you're working on, and just if you can say maybe a few sentences about what Beirut Urban Lab does.
Sure. So the Beirut Urban Lab is a research center that's based at in the Faculty of Engineering and the American University of Beirut. So we were 4 colleagues: a graphic designer, Ahmed Gharbiyeh, a political scientist and urbanist, Mona Harib, an architecture and urban historian and practicing urban designer, Huwaid Al-Harithi, and myself, and I'm trained as a city planner. And the 4 of us found ourselves project after project collaborating together in order to respond to issues that we were facing as people who cared about the city's built environment or the regional or cities in the region, post-war reconstructions, refugee crisis, or responses. So we began to find ourselves collaborating increasingly together, trying to involve students. And finally, in 2018, we managed to together set up this research lab. And the ambition was, and I think we're really proud about what we've been able to do since then. The ambition was to be able to first create like a permanent institution, a space where data about cities, first Beirut and hopefully others, can be collected in objective, transparent ways that can be shared. One of the things we suffer most from is the fact that there is no objective data about Beirut. There was no base map of Beirut when we started working. So if you go to any project, any consultant that's starting to do another project, you'd find that they start redoing the city map from scratch. The aerial photographs don't correspond to the cadastral maps that show the property lots. They don't correspond to road maps. So there's no coordination between public agencies. It's impossible to take stock of who's doing what. And so we worked for 8 months actually with different public agencies, and we collaborated with the Lebanese National Research Council to have an accurate base map of Beirut that we now give to everyone for free. It's available on our website. And we said, okay, from there on, we're going to continue to collect data and make it available so that there's a base knowledge of Beirut. And that first idea of creating a commons, data as a commons, a space where people can come and get data, add surveys, where we support anyone, like a neighborhood community group that wants to survey their neighborhood. So of course, there's a lot of issues on what data do you share, what do you make public, how do you protect people. We're very careful about that, but we're trying to expand that database to be able to create first an informed shared base of knowledge that can be used by everyone. And then on top of this, you begin to think about what kind of projects or collaborative projects such a base of knowledge can create. My own project that I've been championing is one about housing justice. So I've been working on rent. I've been working on real estate developers and who they are, how they work together, how they're intertwined with the banking and the political class to make Beirut more exclusive. And we've been working with the public housing agency. We've convinced them that they should absolutely champion what we call a tax, a vacancy tax. So if you're familiar with what's happening with housing, to prevent cities from being just assets that are for sale, what cities are doing is they're introducing vacancy taxes. So apartments that stay empty for more than a year are taxed and then overtaxed. Well, hold yourself in Lebanon. If you leave your house empty, you're exempted from paying municipal tax and property tax. So we're encouraging speculation. And so we've actually just finished a survey of all vacancy in Beirut and can tell the number for the first time now. It's 19% of Beirut's apartments are empty. I think it's an underestimation because a lot of the very posh buildings did not give us access. But we have at least 1 in 5 buildings in Beirut that 1 in 5 apartments in Beirut that is vacant. It's huge. it's like what cities call hyper vacancy, and it's you set alarms and you try to see how you respond to it because you've just killed the urban economy. So that's like one big track that I champion. We also work on urban governance.
And by before you keep on going, by vacant, do you mean and I live in Nigeria, but I have an apartment, or and I live in Riyadh? You mean actually there's no furniture, no one lives there at all?
Half of them are fully empty, no furniture, and the other half, we were told by someone at the entrance that no one has visited it for a year before we checked it as vacant. That's vacant.
Okay, so no one has visited for a year. Gotcha.
Yeah. But at least half of them are fully vacant.
Yeah, but if you expanded the criteria to, okay, I come for 1 week a year, but otherwise it's vacant.
That's definitely that's a good question. We felt that if we include this in the vacancy, first the numbers are going to be even more scary. I mean, you also have like with COVID and the aftermath and the financial meltdown, many people have made the choice to live in a rural area instead of being in Beirut, and they occasionally come to Beirut to see their kids, but their apartments are empty for most of the year. And so if you make that option, your vacancy rates are going to be even higher, but you'll also be accused of alienating expats who send incredibly important remittances back to the country. So we've made the choice to say, okay, what's in the collective interest in any way or form to rent out at least and allow to be occupied. And definitely at least this 1 in 20 this 20% apartments should be occupied. And there's all sorts of correlations that you see in other cities that are applicable here. I mean, one of them is the more you have income inequality, the higher the vacancy rates are. It's fully correct here. It's been verified in tons of places. We know now, like ESQA published, I think, a couple of years ago, a study that showed that like 10% of the 10% of the population owns more than 70% of all the personal wealth in the country. So you can go on and on.
Can you say that statistic one more time?
Yeah, it's like 10% of the population owns more than 70% of the assets. Yeah. There used to be a number that the central bank had circulated a while back that said that before the financial meltdown, that 1% of the account holders hold more than 50% of the all the holdings in the banks. So income inequality is a very serious issue in the country, and it translates in the kind of city you have. And it then spirals, right? Because once the apartments are empty, no one is shopping in the local small grocery store. The local grocery store is closing. That's creating even more need to sell it, etc. And so that basically kills the local economy. One of the main things we use as city planners to determine a neighborhood health is how many times a dollar circulates in a neighborhood before it goes out. So when the only shopping that is there is going to Spinneys and coming back home, you're not supporting the neighborhood in the same way. Yeah.
Okay, I have one last question before we have to go. I know we're close to being out of time, which is everything that you've talked about at some point in the conversation comes back to the ability of the state to implement these ideas. In a place like Beirut, which is a city in a country that many have described as a stateless country, a country with a very weak state and maybe even a weak nation, what's the way forward? I mean, how could we possibly imagine a better version of Beirut without engaging in fairy tales? If we understand that the state is so weak, can we rely on the baladi? Can we rely only on the municipality? Or we actually have to go through, national bodies?
I firmly believe in collective action. I firmly believe in that we should be looking at municipal elections. They're coming up in Beirut. I firmly believe that they are an incredible opportunity for change. And I firmly believe that people want it. I mean, you just need to look at the experiment in the 2016 elections that we did with Beirut Madinati. We mobilized in 4 months. We got more than 30% of the votes. It's incredible. Many of us who were speaking were born and raised in Beirut, but don't have the right to vote here. So I do think that local elections make a difference, that having people in office who care, who want to be involved is important and can begin to bring echoes from a lot of neighborhood-based initiatives. But we shouldn't just wait for elections. I think that there is a lot of space for collective action, for neighborhood-level mobilization that can actually make a difference. So I think, like from my role in a university, I think that creating a base of knowledge, creating that can become a place where people can collaborate is a good place to start, but it's an ecosystem of change. You just have one place and you need to find echoes in many others so that change actually can happen. But it definitely can.
Muna, thanks so much. This was really, really interesting, and I appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this superb series, really, of podcasts.
Thanks so much. If anyone wants to find out more information, please do yourself a favor. Go to BeirutUrbanLab.com. There's some really amazing information, and you can download reports and check out all these dashboards. Really, really incredible. Thanks, Muna.
Thank you.